Hello, welcome, good afternoon. I see people are joining us, but we do have a lot of information to cover, so I'll just get us started with our housekeeping as folks enter the room. But welcome to our All About Evaluations presentation. My name is Kylie, and I will be your Zoom support for today. And we have Michael Verini here, who will be leading our discussion. Just a little bit about Include NYC. For more than 4 decades, we've been helping young people with disabilities, their families, and professionals. We offer a workshop like the one you're on today, a helpline, and a variety of resources on our website. And I will be adding both our helpline phone number and our website URL in the chat box for you all in just a moment. We are in webinar mode today, so just a little bit of advice here. When you enter your room, your sound and video are automatically off. But if you do have any thoughts or technical issues, we do have our chat box enabled. And if you have any questions, we also have our Q&A box, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation today. Just note, we might not be able to answer every question as there is a good amount of people registered for our workshop today, but we will add information for you to follow up in the chat box after the webinar. I'm also adding our instructions for Spanish interpretation, which we are offering for today's session. So if you'd like to listen in Spanish, you can click the interpretation or globe icon in your Zoom window and then the language you'd like to hear. And we also have subtitles in a variety of languages for today's session. So you can click the show captions in your Zoom webinar control if you would like subtitles for the session. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Michael to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Kylie, for all the support, both preemptive and, as we go along this next hour. And thank you all for joining for all about evaluations today. So let's dive in. So here's what our plan is looking like for the next hour. So we're going to start off this all about evaluations by really discussing why evaluations matter, particularly in the world of special education. And then we're going to look at some tips in interpreting evaluations, and then practice using those tips together by marking up a sample evaluation. Then we're going to discuss some occasions where some supplemental evaluations outside of school-based testing might be warranted. And then lastly, we'll have some ample time for Q&A. So, as Kylie told us, again, if you have questions, definitely feel free to throw them into the Q&A box. That should be at the bottom of your screen, and Kylie will keep an eye out for them. If it's a particularly timely question related to what's being shown on the slides, Kylie might jump in and ask me about it. Otherwise, we will have time to go through them at the end, but I encourage you to just put the questions down as they come up. So also what Kylie is going to do now, she is going to drop the Google Drive of materials for this workshop today, including the workshop slides in the chat box. You also should have received this maybe about 15 minutes ago via email. If you did not, definitely let us know and we're happy to share it with you again. So, in terms of my background, specifically within the world of evaluations, so I previously worked as a school psychologist in both the public and private school systems in the greater New York City area, and I possess permanent certification as a school psychologist in New York State. And during my time doing this direct work in school systems, I gained experience in administering a lot of different measures for evaluations, including things like social and emotional functioning, as well as cognitive, which is often called IQ testing. So, with the administration as well as the interpretation of supplemental assessments that are often completed outside of the school setting, which we will explore some examples of those together and kind of talk about the differences. I also have experience serving as a district representative in impartial hearing cases as well. So all of this experience brought me into Include NYC, where I now serve as a family engagement training specialist, which is really at its core connecting with families, school staff, and outside providers across the cities through workshops just like these, as well as one-to-one assistance via our helpline. Kylie mentioned that earlier, but again, she's going to drop that in the chat box. And please feel free to reach out to us if you're seeking that free, confidential, and individualized support. We're happy to chat with you more. So now you know a little bit about me. I'd love to get a sense of who's in the virtual space today. So Kylie's going to launch a poll for us, super quick, just two questions. Really wanted to get a sense of the age of your child or the children that you work with, and where you would rate your confidence in interpreting evaluations, just so I get a sense of where we're at as a group. So, Kylie, you could just leave that open for another 30 seconds and we'll check in and see what the group's looking like today. And then as we're doing that, we're going to transition into the core of why evaluations matter. So before we're getting into those tips for interpreting and things like that, rooting ourselves in why these matter based on how they're currently set up in the world of special education. So awesome. Thank you, Kylie. So we look like we have a nice spectrum of ages here today in terms of personal children as well as children being supported in a professional capacity. So it's a nice mix from the littles, 0 to 3 years old, all the way up to high school and beyond. So that's fantastic. I'll be sure to try to include examples that span a variety of age groups as best as I can. What I will say is that a lot of our information today can be applied to evaluations that are completed from birth all the way up through adulthood. The tips are pretty broad, and would apply for all types of evaluation reports. And then in terms of confidence, we're seeing a lot of that kind of in that a little confident range where you might have some background but are looking to build your capacity there. So that's fantastic. I appreciate those who joined in there. That really helps me out a lot. So in the evaluations matter. So as that's written, again, in the world of special education, evaluations typically operate as kind of the gateway of access for services, from early intervention through adult services. Also, evaluations are legally entitled to families who request them, as per the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, called IDEA. That is a federal law that applies across the United States. Kylie's going to drop a link in the chat. If you're interested more in the specifics of what's written regarding evaluations in IDEA, I encourage you to check it out, as it has really detailed information at that link. Um, and then lastly, the third bullet, so evaluations provide data that can be viewed in comparison to national samples of same age or same grade peers. So to kind of display that, I'm going to give an example. So let's say that we had an 8-year-old that participated in the WISC-5. That's a common cognitive slash IQ test, utilized for children. So let's say that this 8-year-old yields a score, a full scale, like an overall score of 87. This would place them at the 19th percentile. So that doesn't mean they got 19% of the questions correct, but it means compared to 8-year-olds all across the United States, this child performed better than 19% of these peers and weaker than 81% of these peers. So basically, it's not as much to be concerned with the numbers in this example, but just the fact that we're able to make a comparison about a child to other children of the same age nationwide. That's really where evaluations can be a valuable tool for that wider analysis and comparison about how a child's doing versus, let's say, just looking at a classroom comparison or even a school-based comparison. We don't know how that actually would compare them across the United States. And the large majority of evaluations that are completed as part of special education evaluations have those national samples or national norms. So we're able to make those comparisons. So in terms of the frequency of evaluations, this is probably a bit more of common knowledge to many of you on today. But as per the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that IDEA, again, evaluations should be completed every 3 years for a student with an IEP at a minimum. So families and schools can agree not to complete evaluations and substitute what's sometimes called a record review instead, which is, again, utilizing classroom data and prior evaluations may be completed 3 years or 6 years ago, but that's really only if both parties agree to do so. So generally, it's the every 3 years rule. However, both families or schools can request updated testing or updated evaluations more frequently for many reasons. And I just listed a few on the slide, but it could include the major life change within the child, medication changes, as well as the students still struggling with the supports having been in place for quite a while. So again, testing can be completed more frequently. However, I did want to note that a child typically can't complete the same assessment. So for example, I said the WISC-5 earlier, which was like that cognitive or IQ measure. You typically can't complete that same assessment more than once per year. Because that's the way how a lot of these assessments are normed. It would lead to what's called practice effects. Basically, if a child was given this measure, and they were given the same thing 6 months later, it's too short of a time span, and there may be those practice effects because they've seen the material before. So I say that just to keep in mind, as sometimes evaluations might be done in the school and they might be done outside of school. So just making sure that there's not that exact repetition of certain measures within 1 year. And then a big piece I wanted to emphasize is how to use evaluations as part of further educational planning and really that advocacy piece. So again, evaluations can give us so much information, especially when considered together with like classroom data, home observations, community observations, just from what we see and how our child interacts at home and interacts with others in the community, as well as the students' input themselves. So we want to take all of this information, including these formal evaluations, and then use that information to advocate for specific services or supports as part of educational planning. That's something that evaluations can really help us do. So, to give an example, let's say that as part of a reevaluation in for your child in the New York City public schools. There was a teacher completed a social emotional rating scale. So that's something where they basically bubble in their answers with certain statements to see if it fits or does not fit your child. Let's say that those answers yielded what's called an elevation or clinically significant on a subscale called anxiety. That doesn't mean that, let's say, your child has a diagnosis of anxiety, but it could indicate the potential need for, let's say, school-based counseling support to work on these schools' coping skills. So again, we're connecting the specific information from that evaluation, which was that teacher report, and we're connecting that to a potential intervention, which is that school-based counseling support. So that's again just one example to get you thinking. We could also use evaluation information to analyze progress made in services over time, as well as examine similarity or contrast between how a child does at home, how a child does at school, in the community, etc. So we really want to take the best of what works across contexts and generalize these successes because we want to see as much as possible to set the children up with supports so that they're able to bring out their best in all of these contexts. And that really leans into the homeschool communication piece. So having the school communicate with families and vice versa about successes as well as things that have been more difficult, so we can help each other out and bring out the best in both environments. Great. So in terms of evaluation run through, so before we actually go through a sample together with some tips, I want to show you some tips that we have. So, Kylie's going to drop in the chat our understanding evaluation reports tip sheet. This is from our Include NYC website. I just took some of it and put it on the slide again, but I encourage you to check out the link that Kylie sent. It's a little bit more comprehensive. But we're still going to go through this and then use it with our sample report coming up. So I kind of said this earlier, but these tips are really designed to apply to a wide variety of evaluations for a wide variety of age groups. So this can include a psychoeducational report, which is actually the sample we're going to use today. This includes that cognitive or IQ assessment, typically completed by a school psychologist, as well as academic testing, which could be things like math, reading, and writing. This might be completed by a school psychologist or a special education teacher. So we're going to look at a sample of that report today. But these tips could also apply for things like related service evaluations, let's say for speech services, for physical therapy services. It could really apply for quite a wide array of evaluations. So the goals is really to break down evaluation reports that could be a bit lengthy, a bit dense, have some of that jargon that makes it more difficult to understand, and then break it down into basically getting the high points from it, and being able to connect with those if you need more support in interpreting it. So, let's see. So we have start with the summary. So this is a great tip when you get especially a very long evaluation report. It's nice to go down to the summary to read that over, to kind of prime yourself to what else you're going to see throughout the entire report. It's like getting a little bit of like a spoiler if it was a movie or like a teaser of what to expect, but it helps you ground yourself in kind of what at least the report writer thought was the most important information to share. That's typically found in the summary. Then we want to also note the behavioral observations. Typically on evaluation reports, there will be a behavioral observations section. We want to take a look at this to make sure how the child um, acted and performed during testing. We would want to see if there was anything that would call the results into question. For example, if a child had a really hard time engaging during testing, um, you would think that the results maybe have to be looked at a little bit closer because was it really the child's best performance? So that's why we want to check the behavioral observations to see how the child did. Um, and then throughout the report, considering highlighting. So this could be done both digitally and in paper. So again, we're going to show it digitally today, but with all of these evaluations, you could always print them or request paper copies. Um, I like things digitally because you get to save them, but paper is also great too. So for example, you could set up a system where if I highlight in yellow, that means it's something I think is important. If I highlight in pink, I'm saying this is something that's confusing me. These were just arbitrary. You could set up whatever color system that is most helpful for you. And of course, going along with that, taking notes. So writing things down on the report. This is not something where you can't write on the report. It's your copy. You should be able to mark it up as you see fit. Write any notes, questions, things that you're thinking about throughout the report. You could totally do that. Um, as well as now we're on the fifth one, the fifth row, focus on trends, not outliers, especially in very lengthy reports. There's going to be quite a bit of testing that was completed, with a lot of numbers, a lot of different scales, percentiles, things like that. At the end of the day, you want to hone in on patterns and trends. They really tell more of the story of what's going on. We shouldn't be hyper focused on, let's say, one subtest score within one broader test within an entire report. We want to look for the trends throughout or the patterns. And we'll kind of talk through how that looks in a report next. And lastly, just leaning into your network. So, reading the report with a friend or family member can be a great way to get a second opinion on the report about things that jumped out to them, particularly if they have experience working in education or have a child that's navigated the evaluation process as well. That could be super helpful, as well as reviewing with the report writer. So families have the right to reach out to the report writers, whoever completed the evaluation, to discuss it further, just to gain more clarity. So making contact with the person that wrote it could oftentimes clear up questions that have come up because they were the ones that wrote the reports. They might have that insight. So. This is going to be our report sample. Again, this was included within your Google Drive link. For those that joined us a little bit later, Kylie, can you just throw in the Google Drive link once more? I'm going to pull it up now. And let's try some of these tips in practice. So, all right. So here we are. So, as I mentioned before, we are looking at and this is a sample report, by the way. This is not a real report. This is not, Kevin Johnson is not an actual student whose report I plucked out to use for this. It says at the top, this is not a real psychoeducational report, but used for training purposes and things like that. So, what we have here is that confidential psychoeducational report. So we're going to be looking for some of that cognitive, that intelligence or IQ testing, as well as the academic piece, the educational testing, which could include math, reading, and writing. So we're looking through this and we want to keep some of those tips that we just went through in mind. So, first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to be using my highlighting and drawing tools here today digitally, but again, you could print these and do it via paper as well. So, if we're looking at this report, really the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we know what we're reading here. This is a psychoeducational report. If your child is going through an initial or reevaluation, you're likely receiving a ton of evaluation reports. So just make sure you know which one is which to start with is a great place. And confirming that, yes, this is my child here. And then next, the reason for referral. That's great to take a peek at before the summary, just to get a sense if you didn't know, why was Kevin referred in this situation? And we see here that he was referred by his teacher due to concerns about slow progress in reading, especially his difficulty sounding out words. So really the slow reading progress was the concern here, and it came from the teacher. So given that, we're going to jump down now to our summary. So the summary, again, typically is going to be at the end of the report. It might not be the very end because we see here we actually have some like tables with numbers on them. Um, so we're going to look for that heading that says summary, and we're going to take a look through. And I'm going to call some things out that are jumping out to me right now. So it says that Kevin was referred by his teacher. We see here that Kevin's current level of intellectual functioning is estimated to be above average. So that's that cognitive piece. The words cognitive and intellectual are interchangeable for this type of testing. So we're seeing here that he's falling above average. When we see those indicators like average, below average, those are great things to highlight or make note of. Then we see in our next sentence that Kevin's performance in word reading is well below average, which is lower than what we'd expect given his current intellectual functioning. In contrast, his reading comprehension is average and is similar to his current intellectual functioning, which we see in our first highlight was estimated to be above average. Then we have Kevin's math calculation was above average, and his math reasoning was average, and his writing was average. So, given the information in this summary, it seems like we have a lot of average to above average scores, but we have here this one score here, word reading, is well below average. So that's something I'd probably want to make a note of in the margin. I would say something like intellectual versus word reading, because that was really the discrepancy we saw here. We saw that a lot of scores were quite high, but we saw the difference between the intellectual functioning and the word reading. So now we spoke earlier about looking at patterns and trends. It's kind of early to say if we know that this is an outlier or not. So let's take a peek through and look at some more specifics. But now we have kind of an understanding of overall how Kevin did during testing. So with that, I'm going to scroll back up and we're going to run to our actually, we're going to run to our assessment methods. So we want to make sure, okay, what was done here is that intellectual or IQ testing as well as the academic testing. So that's what we're going to see here. And before that, our behavioral observations. So in this report, it's interesting. We have both classroom observations as well as the ones that were observations during testing. So, we're going to focus in on the test session observations because typically classroom observations would be mentioned elsewhere, but those are great to take a look at because then you're able to get the input from someone who basically visited your child's classroom and looked specifically at how they operated within the classroom. But for us today, we're focusing in on the evaluation observations. So we see here that Kevin was pleasant and cooperative. Let's see. He was pleasant and cooperative. He tried all tasks, even hard items. He maintained attention, followed instructions. So again, I'm getting a lot of the high points here. So overall, they're saying they think this evaluation is valid because he put forth good effort during testing. So we want to make sure if there was some issues with behavior during testing, there's some kind of note or comment about how that could impact the results. But in this case, Kevin attended, he followed directions, so we could look at these results as being an accurate indication of his current functioning. So with that, we have um we have his, let's see here, Kevin's scores on the intellectual ability test. So these are going to be more broad. What we should note with graphs is it says here that our average range is 90 to 110. So this range might vary depending on the types of tests you see. So you want to make note for each assessment. Is it this 90 to 110 range or is it going to be different? The nice thing on this graph is that they showed us what the average range is because we could see here, and I'm going to just circle it in blue for you all. It was shaded in with a darker gray color, so we're able to kind of see that, which is nice. So what we see here is it looks like that everything fell average to slightly above average. So I might make a note on the side and just say, IQ average to above average. So we might make a note of that. Because again, we want to mark things up, but we want to make notes that'll help us when we go back to it, or if we're reading it with a friend, they could kind of see what we were thinking. So with that, I'm now scrolling downwards again. So generally, we would look a little more in depth with the text, but there are a lot of graphs in this example, which help us to visually see things quite well. And our note here is we see this word reading is falling below. It's not in this gray range here. It's actually a bit lower. It's about in the high 70s. That was really kind of Kevin's area of weakness here, which was lower than expected based on his intellectual or cognitive functioning. So that's definitely something important to note. Otherwise, we had his reading comprehension that was average. So anything falling in these gray bars or above this little gray shaded range between 90 and 110 will be considered average. So we see here math looks average as well. I'm scrolling down. Writing looks the same. So that's great. So we just made note again of that word reading being kind of the one weakness within Kevin's profile. So given that now, um, we have basically gotten a good summary of this report. We made sure we knew the type of report. We made notes about the reason why this report came up, what testing was done, and then really the specific testing results. Now, in looking back at the summary, we can see that pretty much from our highlighting, it matched what we saw in the reports. Everything looks accurate. And based on this, I might have some questions. So for me looking in this, one of the main questions I have, and I'm going to highlight this in pink just because we said pink was more if I have questions about it. When then it was mentioned that word reading is well below average, which is lower than what we would expect. Well, what are the potential reasons for that? So if I was a parent reading this, I would have questions about why are we seeing this major gap here? What could be the potential reasons for it, and what could we do about it? Otherwise, I think that was the high points I wanted to hit there. So I hope running through that was helpful. Again, this is that psychoeducational report, which we see in both typically initial as well as re-evaluation testing. And again, all these are in your Google Drive, so you can take a look at it later, try to mark it up yourself, and then maybe try with one of your child's reports. All right, so now I'm going to jump back. So we have our example there. And now those considering the supplemental evaluations. So let's say that we saw that psychoeducational report and we're like, okay, this is great, but I still have questions that have not been addressed through this report or through all of the evaluation reports that I received from the school. So in these cases, you might be considering supplemental evaluations to get a fuller picture of your child. So in this case, I really encourage you to think of these three questions to guide you in where you should be seeking these evaluations. So first of all, really specifying what is the concern. Are you looking for something specific? Let's say testing related to sensory processing or sensory functioning. Looking for more diagnoses, looking potentially for an ADHD or an autism diagnosis. So really hammering in on what are you looking for the evaluations to be able to answer? And then considering what information do I already have? This information could be from evaluation reports as well as classroom data, your own observations at home. So you might be able to answer some of this information, maybe medical records, like looking at the information you have and then really determining what do we want to find out. If we were to complete this supplemental evaluation, what information would it give us? So by clarifying the specific concern and then the goal of what you're looking for, it gives you a better course of action. I did want to note some special considerations um, related to supplemental evaluations. So we did have a lot of birth to 3 and 3 to 5 age group here today. So preschool and earlier families. So an example could be something like, let's say, seeking diagnostic clarity. I think my child might have ADHD or something like that. So let's say if it was a preschool child and you were seeking that out, again, it'll vary, but typically medical providers are not going to diagnose ADHD at a very, very young age. So type of supplemental evaluations may vary depending on your child's age. So that's something that you could always check in with, let's say, medical providers, school providers about. Um, but that's again just one example. And then the recency of prior evaluations I spoke to earlier, just really making sure that if your child is completing a similar type of evaluation within the same year, so for example, completing that, let's say completing this psychoeducational report twice in 1 year, making sure that, let's say, if the testing was done a second time, that Kevin was not given the comprehensive intellectual ability test because he already took that a few months ago, and the results would not be accurate if he was retested with that same evaluation. So again, there's things to keep in mind. Um, and then supplemental evaluations. So by no means is this a comprehensive list, excuse me, of supplemental evaluations. These are just a few that I've thrown down. Kylie is going to drop another one of our Include NYC tip sheets in the chat titled All About Supplemental Evaluations. This is where a lot of information from this slide came from. I encourage you to check it out if you are interested in some of these supplemental or outside evaluations for your child. So that first row, the psychoeducational, that's similar to what we just reviewed together with the example with Kevin's report that we marked up. So a psychoeducational is required for students receiving special education services, and it's typically completed by a school psychologist, but then also a special education teacher might do the educational testing component. So it includes that cognitive or intellectual testing, as well as educational testing, which is the assessment of math, reading, and writing. Sometimes a social emotional or behavioral assessment might be done via rating scales that are completed, but that will vary. And let's say we have this report. Let's say the evaluation is comprehensive enough where we don't really need any additional information. But then there are some cases where we might still have some gaps. So the 3 rows below the psychoeducational are just some examples. So Not going into super depth with the middle two, neurological and psychiatric are both done by medical doctors. For varying reasons, I put them in the right column, but again, it can vary and there is overlap. So it could be related to, in the cases where a risk or threat assessment would need to be done for a child, let's say in order to safely be brought back into the school setting, that might be requested. Um, in terms of neurology, an ADHD diagnosis is something that's more common within a neurologist. But again, there is overlap. It will vary. So I encourage you, if you're considering supplemental medical evaluations like these, to reach out to the medical providers themselves and explain what you're looking for and the questions that you have to see if they would be a good fit. And then lastly, the neuropsychological. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about this. So this is a more in-depth psychoeducational evaluation that typically measures kind of those psychoeducational areas listed in the first row, but also adds on things related to attention, executive functioning, sensory processing, some of those other areas that are not done as much by a psychoeducational report. These are very commonly done when families request what's called an IEE or an independent educational evaluation. Those are typically neuropsychological reports completed by a psychologist with a doctorate degree. These reports can also provide diagnostic clarity, such as, let's say, dyslexia, ADHD, or autism, whereas in the New York City public schools, they don't diagnose these things, but may give a child the educational classification on their IEP. That is not the same thing as a medical diagnosis from either a doctoral level psychologist or a medical provider. So that would be the case. And we have a ton of resources related to independent educational evaluations, which Kylie and I will make sure that you get sent out to you if that's something that you're interested in. And again, so these are just a few examples of supplemental evaluations. Others will vary. So the short question in that last row is, does every child need a neuropsychological report or an IEE, that independent evaluation? The short answer would be no, but it could be especially valuable for those concerns. Again, if we're going back to why are we requesting this? What are we looking for? If, let's say, we have concerns and we're looking for, let's say, potentially to flesh out a diagnosis of autism, that might be something where a neuropsychological report could be valuable for that diagnostic clarity. But it's not something that every child necessarily would need because we may have that information already from other sources. We don't need that to be done again. And that's what we have. I left a good amount of time for us for, again, questions that have popped up. If you have things that come up right now, thank you for joining me. I hope that you were able to pick up some tips and things to use in your practice, whether you have your own child's evaluations or whether you are a professional and completes the evaluations and are thinking, how could I make these more family friendly? I hope it kind of gets you thinking there. Um, but again, I'm happy to jump in with any questions now, so feel free to throw them in the chat or the Q&A box. And Kylie, feel free to jump in with anything that's popped up so far.
Of course, we did get one. It said, who would a parent contact to inquire with the school about evaluations?
Sure, great question. So, in terms of inquiring about evaluations, it's going to vary a bit depending on what evaluation you're looking for. So, let's say based on this, you're looking for that initial evaluation. So, your child does not have an IEP, and is not classified as a special education student. Really, speaking with your child's teacher could be that best bet to start with, to talk to them more about your concerns. If we're talking, let's say, about evaluations for your child who already has an IEP, that individual education plan, um, I would encourage you to reach out directly to that provider who would complete the evaluation. So let's say, oh, I have questions about the psychoeducational report. Well, you could reach out to your child's school psychologist or the person that completes the report or would complete the report. If you're not exactly sure who would complete the report, you could always start with your child's teacher as kind of that basis. Um, and then you could also reach out to people who are part of your either the IEP team, the school-based IEP team for your child, or the Committee on Special Education, depending on who sits in those meetings. So really think about the evaluation type and then go to the person who's most likely to either complete it or have information on it.
Great. We also have someone who is seeking ABA services and wondering how they can get an evaluation to do that since their school doesn't provide those.
Yes, in terms of um, seeking an evaluation. I'm assuming it's for eligibility to be able to have ABA services. That's something that I would definitely encourage you to reach out to our helpline to discuss a little bit further. We do have some resources of agencies in the city that have ABA services. They could also be a good contact to discuss how they frequently are able to work with families in terms of getting that eligibility for ABA services because it will vary a bit depending on certain factors. For example, does your child have OPWDD eligibility already? Is that something you're seeking? So, depending on where you're at in that situation, I would say give us a call. We get more information on that and then help kind of point you in the right direction.
Great. We just got one that came in. It says, who or what is supposed to happen when you submit a neuropsychological evaluation to the school with new diagnosis of dyslexia?
Yes. So in this, with that example, it sounds like you got it done, the neuropsychological report, and you're submitting to the school for their reference. So in that case, there should be a IEP meeting held to discuss the results of this neuropsychological evaluation and how this information can be incorporated into the child's IEP. That is a team decision. It doesn't mean that everything listed in the neuropsych or the independent educational evaluation should be just taken in to the child's IEP. It should be a team discussion with the family as well as the school providers. But that's something where the meeting should be held to discuss this new information that's been gathered.
Great. One just came in the Q&A. So if someone has a psychological evaluation done or a psychoeducational test for dyslexia, should a parent wait for the IEP meeting to hear the interpretation of the evaluation results, or should they advocate for a different time to speak with the team?
Can you repeat that, Kylie? I just
Yes,
want to
so
get a full sense
someone,
of the question.
yeah, so someone had a psychological evaluation done for dyslexia, and they want to know if a parent should wait until the next IEP meeting to hear the interpretation of the results, or convene sooner to hear those.
I see, I see. So in that case, I would say that you have a few options. There's really no like right or wrong. So, assuming that you got the report prior to the meeting and you were able to review it yourself, you could always reach out to the person that did the testing to discuss it, further, or you could again take the tips that we've learned, mark things up, make your questions and notes, bring it to the IEP meeting, and then discuss it there. It really comes down to what I would say. If you have very specific questions or have quite a few questions, it might be a good idea to reach out to that evaluator beforehand. Because during the IEP meeting, you wouldn't want to run into the situation where, let's say, there's running out of time or you feel like you're being rushed a bit. So it might be good to try to connect with the provider beforehand if you have a lot of questions. But either way, regardless, you can make your own notes and you should, again, speak up and advocate and ask those questions, whether it's individually with the provider or during the IEP meeting. Both are acceptable.
Great. And pretty much going off that, if a parent disagrees with an evaluation, what are the next steps?
Yes. So if a parent disagrees with an evaluation, I'm assuming here that it's a school completed evaluation. The family is able to request that independent educational evaluation listed in the fourth row and fourth column here, all the way to the bottom right, that IEE. And that process is quite simple. It's really just reaching out to the team. So it could be a member of the school-based IEP team and putting in that written request, asking for the independent evaluation. I will say we do have a tip sheet on our website that has a sample email or sample language that can be considered if putting in an IE request that I think could be really helpful for your situation. So that's something I'll make sure that we put in that Google Drive or link it in some way here. So you'd be able to access that because that'll really give you some of the language to consider about how to phrase that request for the independent evaluation.
Thanks so much. We do have a question. I don't know if it's entirely relevant to this
Sure,
presentation, but
sure.
someone asked if they are OPWDD approved, how would they get speech therapy services, and where should they look for those?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's not as much within the realm of this. I would just say if you have the OPWDD approval, and you're looking for speech services, it sounds like it's speech services outside of school. That would be really working with your care coordination organization and care manager to be able to set up those services. If, let's say it was in this example, they're looking for speech services in the school setting, that would be a discussion to have with the IEP team. You could either request a meeting yourself, or you could bring it up at your child's annual review meeting, which should be happening on a yearly basis. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions from the chat and the Q&A that I'm seeing.
Okay, awesome. So again, I appreciate the folks that joined us. I hope that you found it helpful. We'll be in touch with these resources. Again, I'm going to add in some more information about those independent educational evaluations for those that are considering that. Otherwise, I encourage you to, if you have any additional questions or very specific questions, to reach out to our helpline. We'd be happy to chat further with you about your situation and see how we can help. But again, wishing you all a great rest of your afternoon. And yes, the poll. Thank you, Kylie. So yes, before you head out, if you could please fill out the poll that just popped up on your screen. We do take your feedback seriously, and we appreciate the input you give us to inform our current and future programming. Once you're done with that poll, and if you have no other questions, I encourage you to head out and enjoy the rest of your day, hopefully less rainy than it was this morning. And we hope to see you again at our future workshops. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Michael. At least it looks pretty sunny here in New York City. But thank you all so much for joining us today. As Michael said, if you can complete our poll before heading out, that would be great. And hopefully we'll see you on another webinar soon.
And again, we'll just stay on for a few minutes to let you all complete it. And if any questions are popping up still, again, feel free to throw it in the chat or the Q&A.
All right, looks like most of you completed the poll. I see some love in the chat and some thank yous, Michael. But we appreciate you all attending today and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Anna.